If the engine-driven pump fails, you turn to your emergency and high-altitude rheostat to increase the speed of the booster pump.
Captain, what's the fuel consumption of the engine?
Well, that depends on your power and speed. For absolute minimum cruise, you'll use anywhere from 60 to 120 gallons an hour. However, at full military power, you'll consume as much as 275 to 300 gallons an hour. When the warning light comes on, you've got a maximum of 20 minutes left. Here's your oil tank up here, and down here are your oil coolers with shutters controlled from the cockpit. This is your main air ramp. This is your GE turbo. It's a lot more simple than it looks. The exhaust gases come from the engine, back through these pipes to the turbo. Compressed air leaves the turbo, comes through the cooling system here, back through these pipes to the carburetor, down into the internal compressor to the cylinders. This is the guts of the system. Let's take a look at the real thing over here. This is a cutaway of the turbo. Now up here is where all of the compression takes place. The exhaust gases come in here and spin this bucket wheel. The bucket wheel is on the same shaft as the impeller, and it's this impeller that actually compresses the air. The faster the bucket wheel turns, the faster the impeller rotates, and the more air is compressed and sent to the engine. Here, just off the exhaust manifold, are waste gates. When these gates are wide open, the exhaust gas is dumped out into the air instead of being directed back to the turbo. But the higher you take your airplane, the more these gates will close, which means the exhaust gas goes back in an increasing amount and puts the turbo to work compressing air for the engine. This action is controlled by a supercharger regulator. You guys will learn a lot about controlling your turbo when you're ready for altitude work. The throttle and turbo on the quadrant are normally linked together, but in transitional training you won't be using the turbo. Later on, if you want to get off the ground fast with full military power, you'll set the throttle and turbo control handle all the way forward, getting 52 inches manifold pressure and 2,700 RPM. Using maximum power for more than 5 minutes isn't a very smart idea, unless you happen to get a hiney on your tail. When you throw this switch on top of the throttle and push both throttle and turbo full forward past the throttle stop, you'll get war emergency power through the water injection on the P-47 D5s and subsequent models. When you're using water injection, water is mixed with gas and you'll really go places. Water injection is available for only 11 minutes continuous use, and you've got to use it sparingly, just like your ammunition. It sounds screwy, but brother, when you need that extra power, water injection will give it to you. Now let me caution you about something. When you're using the turbo and throttle interconnected, they should be retarded slowly. When you're using them individually, always retard the turbo first and then the throttle, making sure the turbo is never left ahead of the throttle. Your landing gear and flaps are operated hydraulically. I'll show you the controls when we get in the cockpit. As for armor, you've got steel plate in front of you about here, bullet-resisting glass, and your engine also gives you protection from the front. In back of you, you've got steel plate about here, and your fuel tanks give you secondary protection from underneath. As for firepower, you've got 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, with a maximum loading of 3,400 rounds. There's a trigger on the stick that fires all your guns at once. And let me tell you, they pour out plenty of hot steel.
How are the guns charged, sir?
Manually, on the ground. Well, I think I've told you about everything you need to know. Outside of the fact the little man said there are 105,895 rivets in this airplane, and enough aluminum to build the biggest kitchen sink in the world. Any questions? Okay, Lieutenant, suppose you come out on the line and we'll check through the cockpit. And the rest of you might be looking through the poop sheets. And get some time in that Republic cockpit training. These flaps are left down to keep them from getting walked on. Well, now, nearly everything in here is familiar to you. But let's look at this cockpit clockwise and see what you've got in the 47 that may be new to you. Now, down here on your left is your fuel selector. You take off on main. On the trim box, you've got your elevator crank here. Now, this knob nearest the rudder is for the rudder, and the one toward the front is the aileron tab control. Also, down on your left, you've got this emergency hydraulic hand pump for use if the engine-driven pump fails. And here, your gun heat control. For your flaps, forward, and the flaps are up. You pull back to lower them. You can stop your flaps in any position by putting the control in neutral. Well, now then, for your landing gear, to raise the gear, you flip this safety lock, press this button, and raise the handle. And be sure to let it go all the way up. To lower the gear, push the handle all the way down.
Sure is a wide landing gear.
You betcha. And that's a big plus for pilots. Well, now then, up here are your indicators for oil and intercooler shutter. Open for takeoff, neutral for landing. They're electrically operated from the switch panel. Well, now, going on clockwise, this is the gun and camera switch. And make sure it's off when you're landing. Turbo, throttle, prop, mixture. When you're starting the engine, you'll keep the mixture control in idle cutoff until the engine is firing. On your switch panel, there's your generator switch, propeller switch, and the rheostat that determines the speed of the booster pumps for your fuel supply. This, of course, stays in starting, except in emergency if the engine-driven pump fails. Here's the landing gear warning light. It's a very important little item. When you push the throttle forward on takeoff, the warning light will come on and will remain on until the wheels have been retracted and are definitely up and locked, at which time the light will go off. It will remain off until your throttle is almost fully retarded, as in coming in for a landing. The light will then come